Have you ever wondered why the conflict between Jews and Arabs seems so endless, so deeply rooted that even modern politics can't fully explain it? Why does tension persist not only between Israel and its neighbors, but even within the broader Muslim world? To truly understand this conflict, we have to go far beyond headlines and history books. We need to go all the way back, thousands of years back, to a story that's not just historical but profoundly spiritual. It begins with two brothers, Isaac and Ishmael. Both were sons of Abraham, a towering figure in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But their destinies, though intertwined, set them on very different paths. Isaac, the son born to Sarah, became the father of the Jewish people. Ishmael, son of Hagar, became the patriarch of the Arab nations, and by tradition, the spiritual ancestor of Islam. Now pause and think about that. The very roots of the two peoples, often portrayed as enemies, began in the same household, with the same father. This isn't just a family drama preserved in dusty scrolls. What happened between Isaac and Ishmael echoes in our world today. The resentment, the rivalry, the displacement, it's all there, embedded in the ancient narrative. In fact, Jewish tradition offers a powerful lens through which to view this. Ma'ase avot siman lebanim. The deeds of the fathers are signs for the children. It means that the stories of the patriarchs are not merely history. They're prophecies. They are living patterns that unfold again and again in the lives of their descendants. And this idea isn't unique to Judaism. In Christianity, it's called typology, the belief that events in the Old Testament foreshadow deeper spiritual truths or future realities. The Apostle Paul often used this method to connect ancient figures like Adam, Abraham, and Moses to the life and mission of Christ. In the same way, some theologians and historians today apply these interpretive keys to understand the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the parallels are staggering. Isaac and Ishmael didn't just represent two brothers with differing fates. They came to symbolize two nations, two worldviews, and eventually two faith traditions that would shape human history. But the conflict didn't start with war. It began with a promise, a divine promise. God told Abraham that through his offspring, all nations on earth would be blessed. But Abraham and Sarah were old, very old, and Sarah was barren. So how could this promise possibly come true? That question, filled with uncertainty and impatience, led to decisions that still reverberate today. And as we'll see in the next part, those decisions created a spiritual split with consequences far beyond what anyone in that desert tent could have imagined. Before we continue, pause and ask yourself this. What if the headlines you read today aren't just about territory, politics, or religion, but about an ancient family story still playing itself out? What if understanding that story could offer not only insight, but hope? Let's look deeper into the promise, the despair, and the moment that set everything into motion. Imagine receiving a promise from God himself, a promise so extraordinary that it defies human logic. Abraham did. He was told that from his descendants would come a great nation, and that through his family all peoples on earth would be blessed. But what happens when that promise seems impossible? What happens when faith meets delay and hope begins to fade? Abraham and his wife Sarah were already advanced in age. Time was not on their side. And Sarah carried the weight of barrenness, a devastating reality in their world. In that ancient society, a woman's value was often tied to her ability to bear children. To be childless was not just a private sorrow, it was a public shame. Year after year, the silence of an empty tent must have made God's promise feel more like a cruel joke than a coming miracle. Can you relate to that kind of waiting? That kind of aching disappointment when you believe something good is meant for you, but it just doesn't come? Sarah knew that pain intimately, and eventually her hope gave way to a desperate idea. Following the customs of the time, Sarah told Abraham to sleep with her Egyptian servant Hagar. If Sarah couldn't bear a child, maybe Hagar could bear one in her place. It was a human solution to what was supposed to be a divine promise, a shortcut to a miracle, and on the surface it worked. Hagar conceived and gave Abraham a son. His name would be Ishmael. But instead of peace, This decision birthed tension. The household that was supposed to carry God's blessing became divided. Sarah, now feeling threatened by Hagar's pregnancy, began to treat her with cruelty. It's one of the earliest accounts of social and emotional oppression in the Bible, between two women caught in a web of insecurity, jealousy, and unmet longing. Hagar did what many of us might do when we feel cornered. She ran out into the wilderness, alone, pregnant, and likely wondering if she would survive. And it's here, in the most unlikely place, that something astonishing happens. In her most desperate moment, God finds her. Not Abraham, not Sarah, the covenant bearers, but the servant woman in exile. An angel of the Lord appears by a spring and speaks to her directly. He gives both a command and a promise. "Return to your mistress and submit to her," he says. "I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count." It's the first time in all of Scripture that God names a child before he's born. And what is that name? Ishmael, meaning God hears. This is no small detail. It's a divine affirmation that God hears the cries of the oppressed, even those outside the center of the covenant story. Hagar, a marginalized woman, is not invisible to heaven. And Ishmael is not a mistake. He is a child of promise in his own right. But Ishmael's promise is different from Isaac's. And understanding that difference is key to understanding the long history of division and the possibility of future reconciliation. Let's move forward and explore how the birth of Isaac changed everything, and how two brothers became the embodiment of two destinies. In one of the most striking and often misunderstood passages in the Bible, God gives a prophecy about Ishmael, the son of Abraham and Hagar. After promising that Ishmael would become a great nation, God adds a description that still echoes across the centuries. "He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all his brothers." At first glance, that sounds harsh, almost like a curse. But it's not. It's a prophecy. And like many prophecies in Scripture, it's layered, symbolic, and reveals more about purpose than punishment. In the ancient world, the wild donkey wasn't seen as a shameful animal. It was actually a symbol of untamed freedom, of fierce independence, of a creature that roamed the wilderness on its own terms, refusing to be bridled or ruled. It lived outside the confines of cities, of walls, of empires. So when God says Ishmael will be like a wild donkey, he's not insulting him. He's describing people who would be survivors, those who wouldn't be conquered easily, who would resist domination, who would endure no matter the odds. And that's exactly what we see throughout history in the descendants of Ishmael, the Arab peoples. Despite colonization, foreign rule, war, and division, they have endured. Their culture, language, and influence have spread across continents, leaving an indelible mark on world civilization. But this prophecy carries a dual edge. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. That's not just external conflict. It suggests a life lived in tension, in opposition, even among his own kin. And tragically, we see that reality playing out too. Internal strife, particularly between Sunni and Shia branches of Islam, has caused deep wounds throughout the Muslim world. Civil wars in Syria, Yemen, Iraq, these are not just political or sectarian struggles. In the shadow of this ancient prophecy, they are also echoes of a deeper unrest, a familial restlessness that has never fully healed. Still, this prophecy is not the whole story, because in the very same breath, God also promised to bless Ishmael. He was not cast aside. He was not forgotten. Ishmael was seen, heard, and honored by God. He would father 12 princes. He would grow into a vast nation. And just as Isaac would carry the covenant, Ishmael would carry a legacy of greatness in the world. Both sons mattered deeply to their father Abraham, and more importantly to God. That paradox is part of what makes Ishmael's story so powerful. He is both the outcast and the blessed, the independent wanderer and the fierce survivor. His story reminds us that divine blessing doesn't always come in the form we expect. And sometimes, strength is forged not through acceptance but through rejection. So when we look at the Middle East today, At the tension, the pride, the endurance, the struggle, it's easy to see Ishmael's story alive in the spirit of his descendants. The prophecy wasn't just about one man's future. It was about people. And as we move forward in this story, we'll begin to see how that wild, untamed independence would one day clash with a very different kind of promise. The covenant carried by Isaac. Isaac's birth wasn't just a miracle, it was a turning point in sacred history. Sarah was 90 years old. Abraham was nearing 100. From a purely human perspective, it was impossible. But when the child finally arrived, it wasn't just the sound of a baby crying that filled the tent. It was the sound of God's promise finally taking form. And that child was named Isaac, which means he will laugh. The name itself was a nod to the disbelief and even the laughter that had once filled Abraham and Sarah's hearts when they first heard God's plan. It was laughter born from doubt, but now transformed into joy. For a moment, all seemed well. The promise had arrived. The heir was here. But not everyone in the camp celebrated equally. At a feast celebrating Isaac's weaning, a public declaration that this child had survived infancy and was being raised as the son of the promise, something happened. The biblical text says that Ishmael, Abraham's firstborn, mocked Isaac. On the surface, that might seem harmless. But in Hebrew, the word used shares the same root as Isaac's own name. It wasn't just mockery. It was a symbolic challenge, as if Ishmael were saying, "You may carry his name, but I am still his firstborn. I am the true heir." This wasn't sibling rivalry. It was a theological confrontation. Sarah saw it clearly. To her, Ishmael's mocking wasn't childish mischief. It was a threat to Isaac's future. And so, with the ferocity of a mother protecting the destiny of her son, she demanded that Abraham send Hagar and Ishmael away. "That slave woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac," she said. It was harsh, painful, and deeply prophetic. Abraham was devastated. After all, Ishmael was his son. For 13 years, Ishmael had been his only child, the center of his hopes. This wasn't just a logistical decision. It was a father's heartbreak. Scripture tells us that Abraham was very distressed. You can almost imagine the silence in his tent that night, the inner war between duty and love. But then God speaks. He tells Abraham to listen to Sarah, not because Ishmael is unworthy, but because a new chapter is being written. God assures Abraham that Ishmael will still become a great nation. He will not be forgotten. But the covenant, the spiritual inheritance, would pass through Isaac. This moment marks more than just a family separation. It's the beginning of a spiritual divide that would echo through centuries. One child receives the promise. The other receives the blessing, but not the covenant. One stays in the camp. The other is sent into the wilderness. And from that moment, the tension between inheritance and identity is set in motion. Think about it. What would it feel like to be Ishmael in that moment? To once be the only son and then suddenly be cast aside because of another? Not because of failure or rebellion, but simply because he was born from human effort, not divine intervention. This, too, is part of the larger story. A story that mirrors the experience of entire nations. And as we continue, we'll see how this wound, this forced separation, didn't end in the desert, but shaped the very narrative of modern history. When Ishmael was cast out into the wilderness with his mother, it wasn't just a painful family farewell. It was the beginning of an identity crisis that would ripple across centuries. This wasn't about relocating or starting fresh somewhere else. It was about being removed from the center of the promise, stripped of a place, and symbolically, if not literally, cut off from inheritance. That moment left a wound not just in one boy's heart, but in the spiritual memory of an entire people. Imagine what it would mean to be the firstborn, to be raised with affection, purpose, maybe even with the belief that you were the future. And then suddenly, because of the arrival of another child, you're told there's no longer room for you, that you're no longer the heir, that what you thought was yours, legacy, blessing, land, name, will now belong to someone else. And the justification? Not your fault, not your actions, just the fact that you were born from a different mother, in a different way. This isn't just Ishmael's story. In many ways, it mirrors how much of the Arab world experienced the creation of the modern state of Israel in 1948. For many Palestinians and Muslims across the Middle East, that moment wasn't a celebration of an ancient prophecy fulfilled. It was a Nakba, an Arabic word meaning catastrophe. Land was lost. Families were displaced. Entire communities felt like Ishmael. Exiled, disinherited, cast into uncertainty while someone else now stood at the center of the story. It's easy to see how this emotional and theological parallel still shapes tensions today. The ancient words of Sarah, that son will not share in the inheritance with my son Isaac, echo, not just in scripture, but in speeches, manifestos, and even national charters. The idea that there can't be two inheritances, two legitimate claims, still fuels some of the most radical rhetoric in the region today. It's not just about land, it's about legitimacy, about who truly belongs, about who gets to carry the story forward. But the tragedy here is layered, because in the biblical account, Abraham didn't want to send Ishmael away. He loved him deeply. His heart broke at the very thought. He pleaded with God, "If only Ishmael might live under your blessing." And God answered, not with rejection, but with reassurance. Ishmael would be blessed. He would become a great nation. But still, the covenant, the unique divine calling, would go through Isaac. Not because Ishmael wasn't loved, but because God's plan was unfolding in a way no one expected. That difference between blessing and covenant is key. It's not a value judgment. It's a divine distinction. But from a human perspective, it felt like erasure. And isn't that still one of the greatest sources of conflict today? When one group's existence feels like the erasure of another's identity? When one people's restoration feels like another people's exile? That's not just politics, it's trauma. It's a memory. It's theology written in the language of borders, bullets, and grief. But if we understand this wound, not just politically but spiritually, maybe we can begin to see a way forward. Not by pretending the pain doesn't exist, but by recognizing where it began and what it means. And that brings us to a deeper question. Was Ishmael truly forgotten by God? Or was there still a plan for him, one that could run alongside the covenant rather than against it? Let's keep going. The answer might surprise you. The difference between a blessing and a covenant may seem subtle at first, but in the biblical story of Isaac and Ishmael, it's everything. It's not just a theological technicality, it's the very line that defines the destinies of two peoples, two spiritual inheritances, and two worldviews that would shape the course of human history. Scripture makes it clear, only Isaac received the covenant. And that covenant wasn't just about land or lineage, it was about a sacred relationship, a divine partnership. The Hebrew word for covenant, beret, speaks of a binding commitment, a chosen connection initiated by God himself. It was through this covenant that Abraham would become the father of many nations, and through Isaac, that covenant would continue, unbroken, eternal. Now here's where the contrast becomes even more profound. Isaac's birth was nothing short of miraculous. Sarah was barren and well beyond childbearing years. From a biological standpoint, there was no hope left. But God intervened directly, breathing life into what was lifeless, fulfilling a promise that defied natural limits. Isaac was the result of divine initiative, not human striving. Ishmael, on the other hand, was born through Sarah and Abraham's own attempt to help God's plan along. His birth came from a very human solution to a very divine promise. It wasn't sinful, but it wasn't miraculous either. Ishmael came through effort, Isaac through grace. This is a key point in understanding the biblical view of covenant. The covenant isn't just a reward. It's a sign of God's sovereign choice, and that choice doesn't always align with human logic. By ancient cultural standards, Ishmael, the firstborn, should have been the heir. But God chose Isaac not because he was better or more deserving, but because his birth represented divine intervention, not human ingenuity. Still, Ishmael was not forgotten. In fact, God promised to bless him greatly. He would become the father of 12 princes, just as Jacob, Isaac's son, would father the 12 tribes of Israel. This symbolic parallel isn't accidental. It shows that Ishmael was not pushed aside. He was given a powerful worldly legacy. He would be fruitful, multiply, and lead nations. His descendants would become vast and influential. But the covenant, that unique spiritual inheritance, remained with Isaac. So what does this mean for us today? It reveals a deeper spiritual principle, that the line of the covenant is never about human effort alone. It's about God's design, his miraculous, sometimes mysterious way of unfolding history. The tension between Ishmael and Isaac isn't just about who received what. It's about two models of inheritance, one rooted in human strength, the other in divine grace. And that distinction still matters today. It helps explain why the descendants of Ishmael have thrived culturally, politically, even militarily, yet remain outside the biblical covenant as defined by the Abrahamic tradition through Isaac. It also sheds light on why the Jewish people have, despite centuries of exile, persecution, and near extinction, retained a unique spiritual identity centered on this ancient covenant. But even this divide is not the end of the story. Because as we'll see soon, the God of Abraham didn't just create two paths, he also laid the groundwork for eventual reconciliation. And the story of these two brothers, while shaped by difference, still holds a key to unity that reaches far beyond lineage or land. Let's keep going. One of the most powerful forces shaping history isn't politics. It's a narrative. The story you believe about your past determines how you see yourself in the present and where you believe you're headed. And nowhere is this more evident than in the story of Abraham's sons Isaac and Ishmael. Because depending on which sacred text you follow, that story takes a dramatically different path. In the Bible, God tests Abraham's faith by asking him to sacrifice his son Isaac, the child of promise, the one through whom the covenant would continue. Abraham obeys, and at the last moment God provides a ram, sparing Isaac's life. It's a cornerstone of Jewish and Christian theology, a dramatic expression of trust, obedience, and divine provision. But in the Islamic tradition, the story changes in a significant way. The Quran tells of a similar moment, a similar test, but it does not name the son. Over centuries, Islamic scholars identified that son as Ishmael, not Isaac. And this subtle but profound shift transforms everything. Why? Because if Ishmael was the son offered in sacrifice, then Ishmael becomes the one whose obedience sealed Abraham's covenant with God. It places Ishmael, not Isaac, at the heart of the spiritual legacy, and it ties him directly to Muhammad, Islam's prophet, as the inheritor of that same faith. In this telling, Ishmael isn't the son sent away. He's the son chosen, the spiritual firstborn. Now, from a purely historical or literary standpoint, one might ask, why would the story change? Why would Islam reinterpret this pivotal moment? The answer lies in Islam's view of Scripture itself. The Quran teaches that previous revelations, including the Torah and the Gospels, were originally true but became corrupted over time by human hands. That's why the Quran presents itself not as an addition to those earlier texts, but as a correction, a restoration of what was lost. So from the Islamic worldview, the story of Ishmael's role isn't a revision. It's a recovery, a reclaiming of spiritual identity and authority. And if that's the case, then the descendants of Ishmael aren't just a neighboring nation. They are the rightful heirs of the promise. This divergence doesn't just live in theological textbooks. It lives on the ground, in sacred sites, in political borders, and in hearts. It's why both Jews and Muslims claim Abraham's legacy. It's why Jerusalem is central to both faiths. And it's why peace in the Middle East can never be only about land. It's also about a story. Whose story is true and whose story wins? But here's something to consider. What if both sons were part of God's plan all along? What if both stories, though different in detail, still point toward the same divine intention? A longing to redeem, to bless, to reconcile. We'll explore more of that possibility soon. But first, we need to examine the sacred ground where these stories collide. And that ground is Jerusalem. There is a city on this earth where the stones speak louder than sermons, and every inch of ground is soaked in centuries of longing, blood, and prayer. That city is Jerusalem, and at its heart lies a single mount, sacred, contested, and claimed by more than one story. For Jews, the Temple Mount is the holiest site on earth. It's where Solomon built the first temple, where the presence of God once dwelled in the Holy of Holies, where priests offered sacrifices, and where prayers still ascend with deep yearning. Below the Temple Mount, clinging to its western side, is the Western Wall, a remnant of the retaining wall that once supported the great temple complex. For Jews today, it's the closest accessible place to what they believe was the center of divine communion, a symbol of hope and sorrow, restoration and exile. But for Muslims, that same mountain is no less sacred. It's the place where the Dome of the Rock now stands, its golden crown glinting above the city skyline. Beneath it lies the foundation stone, known in Islamic tradition as the spot from which the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven during his Isra and Miraj, or night journey. According to Hadith, from this very rock he was taken up to receive instruction from God before returning to earth. For Muslims, this makes the site the third holiest in all of Islam, after Mecca and Medina. And so we have a mountain, one location, but two theologies. One foundation stone, but two sacred journeys. The symbolism here is striking. In Jewish tradition, the foundation stone is not just holy, it's cosmic. It's believed to be the very starting point of creation. The rock where Adam was formed, where Abraham prepared to sacrifice Isaac, and where God's glory once filled the temple. It's the axis between heaven and earth. In Islam, that same stone is a literal launch pad, a bridge between the physical and the spiritual. Muhammad's ascent from this point affirms his role as the final prophet, and the Quran as God's final revelation. It's not just about space, it's about succession, about who carries forward God's message. Even the Western Wall, often seen as uniquely Jewish, holds meaning in Islamic tradition. Some Muslims refer to it as Al-Buraq Wall, where the prophet tied his winged steed Buraq before ascending to heaven. What for Jews is a place of mourning and hope, for Muslims is a trace of prophetic glory. One wall, two names. Two stories, one stone. And this is where it becomes clear. The battle for Jerusalem isn't just territorial, it's theological. It's not only about who owns the land, but about whose story shapes its meaning. It's about memory, inheritance, and sacred imagination. Jerusalem doesn't just represent ancient history. It embodies competing visions of destiny. But what if that very collision, those overlapping sacred claims, could also point us to something deeper? What if instead of being a place that divides, this holy mountain could be a place that reveals our shared longing? A longing for God, for peace, for something greater than ourselves? As we move forward, we'll explore how the tension between Isaac and Ishmael, covenant and blessing, exile and inheritance, is written into the very stones of this city. But also, how those same stones might whisper of a coming reconciliation. Let's keep going. If you've ever wondered why Jerusalem, a city barely the size of a small town, sits at the heart of global conflict, you need to look deeper than maps or military zones. This isn't just a territorial dispute. It's not merely about who controls what. At the core, this is a battle over spiritual history, over whose sacred memory gets to define the ground beneath our feet. At the very center of this conflict is a single hill, the Temple Mount to Jews, Haram al-Sharif to Muslims. And atop that hill stands one of the most iconic buildings in the world, the Dome of the Rock. Its golden roof catches sunlight and camera lenses alike, but beneath that shimmering dome lies something far older and far more contested, the foundation stone. In Jewish tradition, this is no ordinary rock. It's believed to be the place where God began creation, where Adam was formed from the dust. It's also believed to be the very location where Abraham prepared to sacrifice his son Isaac, a moment that sealed the covenant and forever marked the Jewish people's relationship with God. Later, it became the most sacred point in Solomon's temple, the Holy of Holies, where the presence of God himself dwelled. But in Islam, this same stone holds a different yet equally powerful meaning. It's from this very place, according to Islamic tradition, that the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven during his miraculous night journey. And so, for Muslims, the Dome of the Rock is not just a monument. It's a gateway between earth and the divine, a proof of divine approval, a claim to sacred continuity. And just a few steps below this tension stands the Western Wall, or the Wailing Wall, where Jews for generations have come to pray, weep, and remember. It's the last remaining structure of the ancient temple complex, an anchor to a past destroyed but never forgotten. But even here, Islam sees a different connection. This same wall is believed by many Muslims to be the spot where Muhammad tied his winged steed before his ascent, making it part of his sacred journey. So what we have here isn't one religion denying the other's history. It's two sacred narratives stacked on top of the same stone. Two competing claims, not just to space, but to meaning. This is why control of Jerusalem is so fiercely contested. Because whoever controls the site isn't just claiming land. They're claiming the authority to say, our story is the true one. In a way, it's not just about who belongs there. It's about whose truth belongs. And that's why peace in this region is so incredibly difficult. Because how do you draw borders around belief? How do you divide what both sides see as indivisible? The tension isn't just horizontal, between nations. It's vertical, between heaven and earth, between what is remembered and what is revealed. But even in this tension, there may be clues to hope. Because both traditions, despite all the conflict, still return to this one stone. Maybe, just maybe, it's not a dividing point, but a meeting place. The very ground where God might one day bring two stories back into one. Let's keep going, because the next moment in this journey may surprise you even more. There's a moment in the biblical story that's easy to overlook. A single sentence, tucked quietly into the narrative. But if you pause long enough to let it speak, it carries a power that transcends generations. After all the conflict, all the separation, all the exile and inheritance disputes, the Bible tells us this: and Abraham died, and his sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him. That's it. No details. No grand speeches. Just the two estranged brothers standing side by side once more, reunited at their father's grave. Now imagine that moment. The silence between them. The memories. The pain. The shared blood. Two men, now grown, shaped by very different paths, meeting again not to argue, not to fight, but to honor the one who gave them life. This isn't just a funeral, it's a glimpse of reconciliation, a prophetic image of peace. Jewish tradition highlights a subtle but profound detail. Isaac's name is listed first, even though Ishmael was the older brother. And not only that, many Jewish commentators suggest that Ishmael intentionally yielded to Isaac, that he allowed his younger brother, the heir of the covenant, to lead, to be named first. And in doing so, he acknowledged something greater than himself. This quiet gesture, simple and symbolic, is often interpreted as a glimpse of what could be. A future where rivalry gives way to respect, where the children of Abraham no longer compete for blessing, but stand together in grief, in memory, and perhaps, someday, in peace. And interestingly, we've begun to see echoes of that ancient burial scene in our modern world. In recent years, something once thought impossible happened in the Middle East. Nations like the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain signed peace agreements with Israel. But what's even more striking than the diplomacy is the name they chose for these agreements, the Abraham Accords. Think about that. In a region fractured by war, suspicion, and theological tension, leaders chose to invoke the name of the shared patriarch. Not David, not Solomon, not Muhammad or Moses, Abraham, the father of both Isaac and Ishmael. It was a symbolic declaration that despite centuries of division, they still come from the same place, that under all the history and all the theology, there's still shared DNA, spiritually and literally. And if you look closely at the mystical streams within both faiths, Jewish Kabbalah and Muslim Sufism, you begin to see something even more beautiful. While they differ in doctrine, their language of longing is remarkably similar. Both speak of the soul as a spark of divine light. Both describe the journey of returning to God through purification, surrender, and love. In Kabbalah, God is the Ein Sof, the Infinite One. In Sufism, he is the Beloved. Both traditions see the ego as the barrier, and union with the divine as the goal. It's as if, when the arguments quiet down and the mystics start whispering, they realize they're speaking the same language. And maybe that's the key. Maybe the path to peace won't come from the powerful or the political. Maybe it starts with remembrance, with two sons burying their father side by side. Maybe it starts with people willing to listen to the deeper story behind the noise. And that leads us to one final question. If Isaac and Ishmael can reunite in death, is there a hope that their descendants might reunite in life? The answer may lie in a figure who stands outside both lineages, but offers a way to reconcile them. Let's explore that next. The story of Isaac and Ishmael is more than a family feud. It's a mirror of humanity's deepest divisions. Two sons, two destinies. Two nations born from the same father, yet pulled apart by promise, politics, and pain. For centuries, their descendants have lived this tension, claiming land, legacy, and truth. And for just as long, the world has asked, can peace ever be possible? Christianity dares to answer that question, not by choosing sides, but by offering a third way. Not Isaac versus Ishmael, not Jew against Arab, but something entirely new. A family born not of blood or borders, but of spirit. A reconciliation that doesn't depend on who inherited what, but on who is willing to receive a new inheritance, through Jesus. This isn't wishful thinking or a theological abstraction. It's rooted in one of the most radical claims of the New Testament. The Apostle Paul, a Jew of Jews, wrote these words in a time of deep ethnic and religious hostility. Christ is our peace. He has made the two one and has destroyed the dividing wall of hostility. What wall is Paul talking about? It's not just a metaphor, it's the spiritual barrier between peoples, the ancient hostility passed down from Isaac and Ishmael, from covenant and exclusion, from chosen and cast out. Paul is saying that Jesus didn't come to reinforce that wall. He came to tear it down. And how does he do it? By forming a new family, a people not defined by ancestry or geography, but by grace. Through the cross, Jesus creates one new humanity out of the two. One new humanity, not one side converted to the other, but both transformed into something new. That's the Christian vision of reconciliation. And here's the beautiful part. It doesn't begin someday far off in the future. It starts now, right here, in the hearts of those who believe. In communities where Jewish and Arab believers worship side by side. In conversations where former enemies call each other brothers. In hearts that refuse to be ruled by ancient grudges and instead are ruled by peace. But Christianity also teaches that this reconciliation is not yet complete. There's still division, still conflict, still a world groaning for healing, which is why the Bible points to a second stage, a future hope. At the return of Christ, what began in hidden hearts will be revealed in global healing. The wolf will lie down with the lamb. Swords will be beaten into plowshares, and the wall of hostility will be gone for good. This isn't passive optimism, it's a call to action. Because Jesus didn't just talk about peace, he embodied it. And he gave a command that defies every instinct of tribalism and vengeance. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Can you imagine a world where Abraham's children live by that kind of love? Where the tomb is no longer the only place where Isaac and Ishmael meet, but the table of grace, where there's room for both. That's not a fantasy. That's the invitation of the gospel. And it's open to all. If this vision moves you, if you want to understand the deeper spiritual story behind history, conflict, and hope, then you're in the right place. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. We're just beginning this journey through faith, prophecy, and reconciliation. Let's discover it together.